The definition of the female gaze, or even its existence, is still a contentious subject. The most common misconception of the female gaze I have found is that if the director is a woman, their film is automatically projected in the female gaze. Unfortunately, this is far from the truth. Films such as Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, and perhaps controversially Emerald Fennell's Promising Young Woman, still portray their female protagonists in an objectively otherizing lens.
I said, "What are you doing?"
The saying of a film being rewritten in the edit room is the same when it comes to the directing of the gaze. The editor has the control over who we see and how we see them. What has come to the forefront of analysing the female gaze is the strong emphasis on connecting with the characters emotionally, not otherizing and objectifying them. Joey Soloway in their TIFF talk about the female gaze stated that the male gaze is
pretty much everything. Everything you've ever seen. It's most TV shows, it's all movies, it's movies that are intentionally objectifying women, like James Bond movies and Wolf of Wall Street. And it's also well-intentioned movies like Her or Ex Machina, Machina.
Soloway articulates in their TIFF talk a three-part definition to what the female gaze looks like. Part 1 is
a way of feeling, seeing,
where emotions are prioritized to the action of the scene.
Reclaiming the body, using it as a tool on the set with the intention to communicate a feeling.
Part 2 uses the camera to show how it feels to be looked at, the object of the gaze, and the journey of women and how they become what men see. Part 3 is the returning of the gaze, understanding that
we see you seeing us and it says, I don't want to be the object any longer.
I believe it is through the edit that the manipulation of pacing and shot choices can aid in shifting the gaze, eliminating the voyeuristic looking and shifting it to the feeling seeing. In her book titled The Female Gaze, Iris Bray's criteria includes narratively the main character identifying as a woman, the story is told from her perspective, and highlights her struggle of being a woman in a patriarchal society. For the film's form, it must be able to convey the female experience. If her body is eroticized, it must be in a conscious gesture. And finally, the audience can't find voyeuristic pleasure. Ultimately, these definitions and criteria lead to the ways in which the female gaze in filmmaking can provide insight into the lived female experience. Karen Perlman dictates that through adding nuance to editing rhythms and pacing, it elicits empathetic connections between narrative and audiences. Pacing for the edit is sentence structure to allow a novel to take place. The ebbs and flows of tension. The tension and release allow for the emotionally pinnacle scenes to hit the audience with the desired effect of manipulating events, emotions, image and sound. In Krzysztof Kieslowski's 1993 film 3 Colors Blue, he explores the grief and isolation of Juliette Binoche's character Julie after her husband and daughter die in a car crash. After the accident and her suicide attempt, the pacing is monotonous, never breathing, just moving forward with no purposeful intent. We feel the neglect and isolation from Julie as she tries to nullify her grief, never giving herself the chance to process until moments of blue encapsulate her. The haunting of her husband's symphony surges up from her mind, playing when her sorrow becomes overwhelming. These outbursts are rare moments where the pacing slows and allows the grief to almost swallow Julie. The consistent pacing after the crash, when Julie is getting rid of her possessions, allows no time for the grief to set in. This acceptance of the situation is unnerving and isn't understood until her grief overpowers her in moments of gravitas when the pacing slows. This is seen when Julie leaves her country estate after her one-night stand with her husband's colleague. then cutting to her walking away, forcing her knuckles to graze against the stone walls, forcing the audience to see her emotional pain through her physical pain. The only long shots we see of her after her suicide attempt are always emphasizing her grief, grounding this scene as one of her most painful moments. Contrastingly, Celine Sciamma's 2019 film Portrait of a Lady on Fire's slow yet intensely intimate pacing allows the audience to feel the growing tension between Eloise and Marianne. Sciamma not only encapsulates desire without objectifying either subject, but she also plays with power dynamics and the idea of gazing. The long-held perspective shots of Marianne watching Eloise builds this tension. Eloise rejects this dynamic of being looked at by Marianne in the pinnacle scene when she finally agrees to pose for the portrait. The shot choices of Eloise being fully in the centre of our eye line as Marianne is protected by the edge of her canvas. The shot changes are equal and frequent as the two women banter back and forth, until Marianne tries to use her dominance in the shot against Eloise. The pacing slows to allow tension to build as we watch Eloise's reaction when Marianne plays with her power of the gaze. This tension builds to a pinnacle when Eloise forces Marianne into her frame. In the longest held shot of the scene, Marianne walks into Eloise's wide mid-shot, for the first time becoming equals in the scene as Eloise articulates,
Si vous me regardez, qui je regarde moi?
This tension is broken as the power dynamics change when Marianne walks out of the frame, and we see her exposed visually and emotionally next to her easel from the direct perspective of Eloise. The pacing of this scene not only shifts the power dynamic of the scene, but shifts the emotional tension from being subject and object to both being subjects of each other's desires. The tension and release of pacing allows the audience to empathise with characters and their situations. Although this is only part of how the gaze can be manipulated, shot choices mixed with pacing allow for the audience to understand the character's emotion or motivation. The editor can have a final say in how the gaze is manipulated. The next part of my research will be understanding the manipulation of shot choices to convey the character's perspective without slipping into voyeuristic objectification.